Okay, hello friends, and welcome back to another live stream here at Empty Cloud Monastery for the Wednesday evening live stream joiners. I hope that you're all doing well, and also everyone in the monastery. And tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion and our contemplation of the Pārāyanavagga, because we did this last week and we didn't get to get through all of it, which we also will not be able to get through today, but at least we can continue a little bit. And so if any of you were not here last week, I'll just give a brief introduction to the collection and what I'm going to be saying and so on, so that you have a little bit of context. And for those who were here last week, hopefully this is enriching and a continuation. So if you have any questions during the discussion, feel free to leave them in the chat, or if you have people in the monastery, feel free to ask after we're finished. So before we get started, we can render homage to the Buddha, the teacher, the supreme teacher, who's the reason that we have this beautiful collection of poetry. And so we can just calm our minds and call him to mind, so that we can focus on these teachings with that sense of faith, really leaning into it, really kind of interested in learning. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammaṃ saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. So sorry if I'm clearing my throat. I have a little bit of a hoarse throat right now. Hopefully it's not too distracting. Hello to Maria, and also someone else who I cannot read your name because it's in Khmer, but hello. And hello also to Vanessa, everyone else joining in. So yes, as we were covering last week, this is a collection of ancient Buddhist poetry called the Pārāyanavagga. Literally means the chapter on the way to the beyond. And the way to the beyond, or the Pārā here, means the far shore. So this is an image of, in ancient India, as well as in some areas of the world today, people who live near a river, that river could flood and it could be devastating, right? So the river could flood the entire area. And when a flood is happening, then you don't want to be on the side where the water is going in. You want to get across to the safety. You want to get across to dry land, to safe land. And so this image of the flood, of violent, dangerous waters swelling up and surrounding us from every direction, where we're going to be swept away in the currents if we don't get to safe land. This is an image that was used in ancient India by spiritual practitioners who were trying to cross over the flood of rebirth, the flood of samsara, right? The flood of continued existence. Because at any moment, the waters of aging, the waters of sickness, the waters of loss, the floods of our desires and delusions, they'll come flooding us, they'll come attacking us, and we can drown in those dangerous floods if we don't find a way to cross to the far shore. Right? So this image of just dangerous flooding constantly, even if we live in a very dry area, in the teaching of the Buddha, at any moment it could be flooded with deadly waters. And so this image of crossing, just imagine that a flood sweeps away a town and so many people die. So many people die in these floods to this day. Just recently there have been all kinds of floods with climate change. The oceans are rising, and more it becomes a reality that the people living on the coast, it's not safe. And we have rain, flood from hurricanes. So when floods sweep through, many people die. Many people are lost. And the people who make it, it's very painful. It's not fun. So this image of the flood, it's what our life is really like. Just imagine how many people die. You know, when we see these horrible accidents, maybe in the news, you learn about floods and dangerous events that go on. That's nothing compared to the amount of people who die in the flood of samsara. Every single day, people are constantly dying. And not just dying, but all the people who die, imagine the grief, the tears that have been shed. At one point, the Buddha says, monks, you have shed more tears in this long round of existence than would fill the 4 great oceans. So these are the seas that were surrounding, that were known in that area. Just imagine how many tears we've cried for ourselves and for the people we love. It would fill more than the oceans. We've wept so many tears that we would drown in our own tears over and over again. And so this is the image. This is the dire scenario. And these people, specifically 16 students of the Brahmin we discussed, the background story to this is of the Brahmin Bhavati. Brahmin Bhavati was a spiritual practitioner who was aspiring to nothingness. He was very humble, and he was a practitioner of meditation. He would purify his mind, probably in some kind of tradition similar to the Buddha's former teachers, Aladakalama and Uddakaramaputta. So both of these teachers seem to have been within the fold of Brahminical meditation. And so this is now known through the tradition of the Upanishads, right? The Upanishads are texts which some of you may know, and these are practiced and studied by people in Hinduism. So people of different Hindu schools, they practice according to and read the Upanishads. But the Upanishads, some of them are very old, and some of them are probably older than the Buddha. And it seems that the Buddha was training in a system of meditation that was based off of kind of what we see in the Upanishads. And there's many, many, many similarities between the Upanishads and the Buddhist texts. There's also very important differences. Very important differences. And those differences start to come through in this discussion, because just as the Buddha was practicing under his former teachers in order to cross beyond old age, sickness, death, samsara, this horrible flood that we're swept up in, the Buddha left home and he tried to practice meditation in order to purify his mind and escape. And the first teacher, for those of you who know, the first teacher in the suttas was named Aladakalama. This man was a meditation teacher, very advanced, who attained the state of Akincanyayatana. So Akincanyayatana means the dimension of nothingness. So if it's hard to wrap your mind around that, that is intentional, because this is a very advanced meditation state. And Aladakalama had reached this state of meditation, and he was teaching disciples and students a system not just of meditation, but also of learning. The Buddha says that he learned under Aladakalama, he could recite these teachings, and he would teach them, and he claimed to know and see. So the Buddha actually learned a system of study, he learned a system of meditation, he trained his mind in various faculties, and he realized what Aladakalama had realized, which was this dimension of nothingness, beyond infinite consciousness, beyond infinite space, a dimension of nothingness, where it seems that nothing absolutely is there, kind of the ground on which consciousness seems to come out of. And so the Buddha realized that. And what the Buddha said is, later recollecting this, he said he left that teacher. He said, Nanibbanaya sangvatati yavadeva akinchanyayatanopapattiya. Okay? So he says it doesn't lead to nibbana. It doesn't lead to extinguishment. Extinguishment of what? Greed, hatred, delusion. Extinguishment of dukkha. Extinguishment of rebirth. Extinguishment of continued existence. So it doesn't lead that. It only leads to rebirth in the dimension of nothingness. So this is why the Buddha left, because he realized that although he had trained his mind extremely proficiently, although he had mastered these teachings, he had learned them, could recite them, could teach them, Aladakalama invited him to be a teacher with him on the same level, no longer the level of disciple, but the level of teacher. So the Buddha was a teacher before he became the Buddha. And he said he left that. So just imagine, you've trained, you have honor, people listen to you. You have deep states of meditation which are said to be enlightenment. And he leaves it. And he goes to someone else. And that also, he gets more advanced than the teacher. When he trains with Uddakaramaputta, he becomes even more advanced, because Uddakaramaputta hadn't realized the state that he was teaching. Uddakaramaputta means Uddaka, son of Rama, or so either the son or the student of a man named Rama. And Rama was teaching an even deeper state of meditation, an even deeper state of what he considered realization, freedom from samsara. And the Buddha also realized that. And he went beyond his teacher. He realized what his teacher's teacher had realized. And also that he left behind, saying, Na nibbanaya sangvatati. It doesn't lead to nibbana. It only leads to rebirth. So just imagine, not only did he practice with extremely advanced meditation masters, extremely advanced systems, was he a teacher? Did he have honor? Did he have what were considered the highest attainments possible? He left it, and then he continued practicing. So most people, they would give up at that point. right? What's the point if you've practiced to that degree and you don't think you think it's impossible? But he continued. And so this is kind of, when we get to this narrative of the Pārāyanavagga, it's this mirror where the Brahmins are almost mirroring the young Bodhisattva, the young Gautama Buddha, before he was the Buddha. They practiced in these systems. They practiced deep meditation. They learned. Their teacher was very learned, it said. Their teacher was a meditator. And yet, they're willing to give that up. So that's what we discussed last time as well. They're willing to just realize the truth because they don't want to get reborn. So it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter that they have many disciples. It's said in the tradition that they all had many disciples and they were all going to see the Buddha. So you can imagine this teacher in front of all these people that have been bowing to them, paying respects to them, learning from them, and now the teacher is in front of someone else and the teacher's saying, please explain, please explain this, right? So the teacher doesn't know. And so this just, it shows us the humility that we can approach the Buddha's teachings with, right? The humility that the Buddha approached his former teachers with. You could say, the former systems that he trained in. He had that humility both to practice them, but also to be able to let them go despite what he had realized in them. So this is what we see. The Brahmins in the Pārāyanavagga, they have this intense faith, this intense devotion, and this intense investigation. And it's that attitude which I think is one of the most important parts of this collection. Right? It's one of the most crucial ingredients if we want to escape samsara. We can't just hope that eventually it'll happen. We have to have that mind state of whatever it takes. So that's where we're at. And we discussed a little bit the questions of Ajita, the very first Brahmin. He's the one who first broke into questions with the Buddha, and he gave very interesting questions, and we only got to scratch the surface of that, despite it being a long live stream. And we also discussed the last questions, the questions of Pingya. Old Pingya, and we only got to scratch the surface of his questions as well. But at this point, I think we can just go ahead and move on from those, even though we could discuss them in much more detail. And I thought that we could go ahead and skip, for now, the questions after Ajita and go to one of the ones in the middle. This is question number 4. So after Ajita asks his questions and the Buddha answers, then a Brahmin named Metteya, Tissa Metteya specifically, Tissa Metteya asks the Buddha questions. The Buddha answers. And Tissa Metteya is a very interesting set of questions because he was also discussed. There's also discourses where different monks are discussing the meaning of one of the verses here. And then they go to the Buddha and ask him about the meaning. So as we mentioned last time, the Buddha also knew these verses. He gave detailed explanations of them as well as his disciples. And so these are something that clearly were considered very profound and very important. But we won't be discussing Tissa Metteya today, I don't think, unless we end up going back to it. And then after Tissa Metteya, there's a Brahmin named Punnaka. Punnaka asks a question. But we won't be discussing Punnaka's question either. After Punnaka, a Brahmin named Mettagu asks, and we will be talking about tonight. And I think we can kind of go into a little bit more detail. So Mettagu means something like one who has lots of metta, one who is full of metta, or one who is a master of metta. Metta gu, so gu is used, for example, in the word Vedagu. Vedagu means Veda master, someone who's arrived at knowledge of the Vedas, which were the Vedas, for those who don't know, are the body of texts that were recited and passed down by the Brahmins. They're the most sacred scriptures in India at that time and also today. So a Vedagu is someone who's a master of the Veda. And a Mettagu is his name. So he's a master or someone who has metta. His name is interesting. And it's not certain, what exactly this is. It's possible that his name in Sanskrit would be something like Maitraka or Mitraka. And it's possible that he was practicing in the lineage of the Upanishad, which we now have, called the Maitrayaniya Upanishad. So there's actually an Upanishad which is named after metta. And it's one of the Upanishads which is a little bit later, probably a little bit after Buddhism. But just to give you a sense that these people, they were practicing in real traditions, right? There's something that it's real. So this is very unique, is when we just look a little bit at his name, you kind of get a hint. Maybe he was, for example, a master in practicing metta meditation. Who knows? Or maybe his name just means is something related to his lineage of spiritual practice, or maybe his name doesn't have anything to do with that. But just the name itself is kind of interesting. Why does he have this name, Mettago? But so what we'll do, as of last time, is I will recite the verses in Pali, in the original language that they're passed down in our tradition. And we'll just go piece by piece. So I'll recite the part we're going to discuss in Pali, and then I'll give the meaning and we can discuss it a bit. And then we will gradually, bit by bit, start going through. So it would be nice to go through the whole thing once and then go bit by bit, but I'm not sure time-wise how that will work out. But if any of you have a preference, then you can let me know, and maybe in the future we can do that. Okay. One thing I will mention, because I didn't mention this last time, is that I'm reciting these. They might be a little bit different if you're following along with a reading, because different versions of this text have been passed down, right? Because it was copied after it was passed down through the oral tradition. These texts were copied for a long time in Asia with manuscripts. And so sometimes different variants appear. So maybe the spelling is a little bit different, or the recension of the text we have is a bit different. And so the ones that I've memorized are a particular, they've been kind of selected to be what seem to be more accurate to the meter. And so sometimes they've been corrected a little bit to fit the meter, because this is in poetry, so it has a fixed meter to it. And so sometimes words will be slightly different to fit the meter in poetry, in Pali. And so if you're following along, sometimes it might be a little bit different. So I might want to mention this just in case from people last time when we were talking about Ajita's questions. You might notice that when I recited, I didn't talk about one of the words that you might see. You'll see it in translations. And that's because that word is beyond the meter of the poem. And in the Sanskrit version of this poem we have, it's not there. So when I recited it, I just recited it according to the meter of the poem that we would expect, and according to the Sanskrit version, rather than adding the extra word, which is beyond the meter. So that's why. So sometimes if you're following, there might be words that are just a little bit different. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. Okay. So Mettago asks the Buddha. He says, Pucchāmitang bhagavā brūhimetang manyāmitang vedagong bhavitatang kuto no dukkha samudāgata ime ye keci lokasmiṃ aneka rūpa. So this is his question. It's short, just one stanza. He says, I ask you, Blessed One, please tell me this. So I ask you, Bhagava, please tell me. And Bhagava is a title for the Buddha. And if you're familiar with Indian languages, Bhagava is also used by other religions. So Bhagava means something like the Blessed One, or the religious leader, or the holy figure. So Bhagava, he's calling the Buddha Bhagava, which shows deep respect. So he's saying, I ask you, Bhagava, I ask you, Blessed One, Pucchāmitang Bhagava, Brūhimetang, tell me this. He says, I think that you are a Vedago, Bhavitatta. So, Manyamitang, I believe that you are, or I presume that you are a Vedago. That means a master of the Vedas. Right, so we talked about this word a little bit. So he comes to the Buddha, this Brahmin. His teacher was a master in the Vedas, according to the story. And the Buddha is actually not a Brahmin, right? The Buddha is a Khattiya, he's a Kshatriya, which means an aristocrat. So the Buddha is actually not a Brahmin. But Mettago, who was practicing in the lineage of someone who is a master in the Vedas, he calls the Buddha, he says, I presume that you are a master of the Vedas. Right, so what this means is he's already saying that he has this deep faith, possibly built up from the previous questions, right? So the Buddha has already answered Ajita, he's already answered Tisamettaya, he's already answered Punnaka. And so by this time, Mettago has heard these responses, and they've sunk in, and so now this faith is gaining. His faith is building. And so he says that the Buddha seems to be the master of the Vedas. And elsewhere the Buddha uses this term Vedago to refer to people like Arahants, because he says that you're not a master of the Vedas just because you can recite these scriptures. You're a master of the Vedas if you truly understand, essentially, the Four Noble Truths. If you become an Arahant, that's when you're a real Veda master. Because Veda literally comes from the word meaning knowledge. Right, so knowledge was equated with this scriptural knowledge, but actually the Buddha is saying knowledge is not knowledge of the scriptures. That's not the true knowledge. That's not the deep knowledge. Deep knowledge is knowledge which is liberating. And the Buddha was also very skilled with language. So at one point he says that one is not a Vedagu if they know the Vedas. They're a Vedagu if they, for example, understand the 3 Vedanas, so the 3 feelings. So in Brahmanism there are 3 Vedas, and in Buddhism we have 3 types of Vedana, 3 types of feeling: pleasure, painful, neutral. So the Buddha said a Vedagu is someone who truly understands the 3 Vedanas, or something like that. I might be misremembering what he says exactly, but he equates Vedagu with Vedana. So that's a pun. And so Mettagu is saying that the Buddha is the Vedagu. So he's the true knowledge master. And but not on the level of scripture. And this will come back later in Mettagu's question. So if you kind of remember a little bit. So Mettagu starts calling the Buddha the master of the Vedas, but he means it in a different sense. And we'll see how this evolves as the conversation goes. And he also says that he thinks the Buddha is Bhavitatta. Bhavitatta literally means developed self. Atta is the self, right? So atta means self, and the Buddha teaches anatta, non-self. And so Mettagu says the Buddha seems to be bhavitatta, developed self. His self is cultivated. It's like he's whole inside. It's like he's one complete person, right? Many people are scattered, or they're growing. But the Buddha is grown. He's whole. He's complete. His person is just complete. Like it's one whole thing that's completely mature, completely developed. So this is the impression that Mettagu gets in the presence of the Buddha. He seems to be this master of the Vedas, this knowledge master, and he seems to be just developed in himself, completely whole as a person. Right? And that's what we're aspiring to. We're aspiring to be whole, not to be depending on things, but to be completely whole within ourselves, which is ironic because we're actually empty. So, he says that the Buddha is bhavitatta, developed in his self. His self is developed. And then he asks his question. So he praises the Buddha, he shows his faith, and then he asks the Buddha, Kuto no dukkha samudagata ime. Where do all these forms of dukkha come from? Where do they all arise from? All this dukkha, where does it come from? In all the various forms that it takes in the world. So this is his question, and the Buddha probably liked this question because Mettagu's question, I believe, is actually the longest one. So it actually has the longest in terms of answers and responses. Just the total poem it takes the longest to recite. And maybe part of that is because the Buddha really liked this question, right? Because rather than asking kind of roundabout things, the Buddha, he's just straight asking, where does suffering come from? Right? And that's what the Buddha talks about. The Buddha declares the Four Noble Truths. That's dukkha, the origin of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha, and the practice that leads to the cessation of dukkha. So that's what the Buddha teaches. That's what his life is about after he attains awakening. And so when Mettagu asks, where does it come from? Well, that's good, because that's exactly what the Buddha teaches. And so this word dukkha is worth going into a little bit. Dukkha, often translated as suffering, as I just alluded to. Dukkha, the most basic meaning of dukkha is just pain. It just means pain. So if someone's experiencing pain, they are experiencing dukkha. The opposite of pain is pleasure, sukha. So sukha is pleasure, and dukkha is pain. And in fact, actually, you can translate dukkha as pain if you want. That would be just a very straightforward, simple rendering of the word. So, for example, in the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha defines dukkha, he says, jatipi dukkha. Rebirth is painful. Jarapi dukkha. Old age is painful. Vyadipi dukkha. Sickness is painful. Maranampi dukkha. Death is painful. And ain't that true, right? So yeah, it is painful, and that's what he's talking about. So there's many forms of pain, right? There's the pain of old age, there's the pain of grief, there's the pain of physical pain, there's the pain of lamentation, there's many different types of pain. And so this is what Mettagu is asking. So all the different forms of pain in the world, there's a ton of them. You lost your legs in battle, you have PTSD, those are both forms of pain. There's many, many forms of pain, all kinds of pain, any pain you can imagine. And Mettagu is asking, where does it come from? Right? And this is just so fundamental. We're suffering. Why? Where does the suffering come from? Where is the pain coming from? And fundamentally, the Buddha says that dukkha fundamentally depends on jati. Jati pachya jaramaranam soka parideva dukkha domana supayasa sambhavanti. Evametasya kevalasa dukkha khandhasya simudyo hoti. dependent on rebirth, old age, sickness. No, I'm sorry, not sickness here, actually. Dependent on rebirth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, despair, all come to be. That is how this entire mass of pain comes to be. That's how this entire mass of difficulty, of suffering, comes to be. So everything, ultimately, why are we in pain? It's because we were born. If we weren't born, we wouldn't experience pain, right? Because there would be nothing. Where would the pain be landing? There would be nowhere for pain to exist. So if we didn't have a body and a mind, well, we wouldn't experience aging. So how do you not get old? It's not by taking aging pills or by putting your brain into a computer, because that computer will just decay, assuming that's even possible, right? So there is no escape from pain if you're born, because once you're born, well, you're going to get old, you're going to die, you're going to experience physical pain, you're going to experience mental pain, you're going to encounter people who are difficult. One of the places the Buddha's foremost disciple in wisdom, Sariputta, someone asks him, what is dukkha? And what is sukha? And Sariputta, he answers very simply. What is pain? He says, abhinibbati, rebirth is pain. Anabhinibbati, no rebirth is pleasure. So very simple. What's happiness? No rebirth. What's sadness? What's pain? Rebirth. Because once you're reborn, there's no escape. You're going to get old, you're going to die, at the very least. You're probably going to get very sick, or at least somewhat sick. And you're also going to experience difficult things. So that's what the Sariputta says. Rebirth is pain, is suffering. Why? He says one of the reasons he gives is because you have to encounter things like family. So difficult scenarios with family. Well, that's inevitable, right? He also things like, harsh words or painful things in the body. So just getting reborn is just inevitable. That you're going to experience some difficult things in life, some painful things. And so the fundamental reason why we're here, why we're suffering, is because we were born, right? So, but there's many different types. So rebirth is just one form of dukkha. That's the first answer the Buddha gives when he defines dukkha. That's the first thing he says. But it's also many things, right? So, but it's important to remember that when the word dukkha occurs in Pali, basically you can just translate dukkha in your mind to samsara. So dukkha, basically it just means rebirth, old age, death, sorrow, confusion, lamentation, grief. So both mental and physical and existential. That's basically what dukkha means. So in just its broadest sense, dukkha just means this existential situation we're all in, where pain is inevitable. And even the pleasurable things, they vanish. So they're not actually satisfying. They're not actually, the pleasure we experience, it vanishes. It just disappears. So we think it's a source of pleasure, but actually it's not. It's a source of the opposite of pleasure, because it vanishes, it fades. And the pain we experience, it eventually also fades, but it's just replaced with more, and there's no escape from it as long as we're in this round. So dukkha, it just kind of means this existential suffering, which is many different types of things. It comes from many different things, but there's a fundamental root of it, and that's what Mettagu is asking. So in his question, we can already assume he was coming from this existential perspective, right? Because if you just ask someone on the street, where does all the suffering come from? You say, oh, it comes from my brother. It comes from my cancer. It comes from the person who cut me off in traffic. Comes from XYZ. Well, no, because Mettagu is actually asking all of it, where does it come from? So all of it comes from one thing, and that's what he's asking. So Mettagu has this wisdom, and this is why the Buddha is interested in teaching these people, right? So that's his question. This faith and this understanding that there is dukkha, and in fact there's many forms of it in the world, but where does it come from, right? Not getting mired in it, but asking, investigating. That's what we're called to do. And so the Buddha answers. He answers with two stanzas. He says, Dukkhasya mang pabhavanga puchhasi tang te pavakami yatha pajanang upadhi nidana pabhavanti dukkha ye kechi lokasming aneka rupa yo ve avidva upadhing karoti punah punang dukkham upeti mando tasma pajanang upadhing nakaira dukkhasya jati pabhavanupassi. That's the Buddha's response. So interesting, because often when people ask the Buddha questions, these Brahmins, they tend to have more elaborate poetry, and the Buddha tends to have more straightforward poetry. So you can kind of get a sense of his personality. So he speaks in poetry, but it tends to be a little bit more straightforward. But here he actually responds, Mettagu asks a 2-line question, and the Buddha responds with an 8-line answer. So this is an important question to him. And so what does he say, right? Where does dukkha come from? He says, the question you have asked me, he actually says, you've asked me rightly. So rightly, you've asked me about dukkha. You've asked me about the origin of dukkha. Dukkha savemang pabhavanga puchasi. About the origin of dukkha, you've asked me. I will answer that to you. I will declare that to you. And the Buddha says he's someone who understands. So he understands. He will declare it as he understands it, or as someone who understands. So the Buddha is saying, as he understands it, as he's one who understands, he's going to declare to Mettagu the origin of dukkha. And then he says, Upadhi nidana pabhavanti dukkha. He says, the source of dukkha, the origin of dukkha is upadhi. Upadhi is the source. Upadhi means something like acquisition or attachment. And it has two meanings. It has an objective meaning and a subjective meaning. Upadhi literally comes from the word meaning to place near or to kind of place on something. So for example, if you rest something on a surface, that could be an example of literally kind of giving the image of upadhi. So it's this sense of kind of resting. It's like a support or an acquisition. So it's something that supports us. You could almost translate it as like supports. And so upadhi in the objective sense, it means the acquisitions that we have that support us. So at one point, Mata says that upadhi is the source of happiness. Because upadhi is things like our houses, our possessions, our friends, our family. It's the things that support us, the things that we acquire, the things that we own. And Mata says that those give us happiness, right? The things that we have, our acquisitions, our supports, those give us happiness. But the Buddha says that upadhi is the source of dukkha. It's the source of pain, suffering, discomfort. It's the source of difficulty. Because upadhi also means the mental attitude of acquisition, the mental attitude of attachment. Because what is an attachment? An attachment is when the mind is supported by something. It's when the mind is dependent on something, right? So it uses it to support itself up and to get pleasure. So an attachment is like the subjective aspect of a support. So for example, we might think, oh, my friends, they're my supports. Or my house, my shelter, that's my support, that's my acquisition. But actually, if we have this mental attitude of attachment, of acquiring our house, then what happens when our house is swept away by the flood? Then we suffer, right? Because we're attached to it. So our mind rests on that. And when the thing that we're resting on gets swept away, then we fall. We fall into suffering. We fall into despair. So upadhi is the source of every form of suffering in two senses, right? In one sense, it's referring to suffering just in the present life. So why are we suffering in the present in a mental sense? We suffer because of our attachments. So for example, we love people, well then they pass away, they get sick, or we lose them, or they disappoint us, or they treat us poorly. And so we have that support, that attachment on those people. But then when we lose that attachment, when we lose that support, we suffer, right? So you can just imagine people that you love, the people that you care about, friends, family. If those people were to be wrongly accused, let's say that the government wrongly accuses them of a crime, the government imprisons them, and they get put to a death sentence. How would you feel? This is actually an example that the Buddha gives to someone when he's describing dukkha. He gives an example of just dukkha in the present life, and he says, yeah, if you're attached, you would suffer because you're attached to them. It's obvious, right? It should be relatively obvious if we're honest with ourselves. When we're attached, it causes suffering. So we think, oh, these things that I'm attached to, these things that I have, they make me happy. But actually, they make us suffer because we have to cling to them, and they're not reliable because they'll fade. People will disappoint us. People will die. People will go away. People will get sick. The things we own will fade. We'll get tired of them. They'll get damaged. They'll get lost. Or, fundamentally, we will die. And when we die, we are separated from all our acquisitions. All our attachments are separated from us at that time. All our supports. And so what's left? And so this is the second sense of upadhi, the sense in beyond this life. Upadhi also means attachment in the sense of acquiring a new life. Okay, so the source, why are we reborn? This other sense of suffering, the existential sense, crucial to our reality. As we sit here right now, we are sitting in a world where if we die, we will get reborn. And why is that? Well, it's because our mind, it looks for something to be supported by. It looks for something to attach to. So this is kind of the crux of it. This is the Four Noble Truths, right? First Noble Truth, rebirth. It says, first Noble Truth is dukkha. Dukkha is defined, the first definition, rebirth. Rebirth, old age, and death. Rebirth, old age, and death, they come whether we want it or not. So it can be confusing to some people. They think, well, for example, how would craving cause rebirth? It causes rebirth, causes suffering, because when the mind has this desire in it, it's like a fuel, it's like a momentum. This desire, this craving which is in us, it's constantly moving forward, looking for something in the future. This is why we can't sit still. This is why the mind can't be still. This is why the mind moves, because it has this desire which is, it's almost like leaning forward. The mind is constantly leaning. And so when we're leaning, we need to be supported by something. And so the mind is constantly leaning forward with this momentum of desire. What's next? What can I get? I want something else. Even on this just very subtle level of like, what do I do? I need to do something, because we think that we're agents. We think that our choices, our volitions are ours. And so because of this, our mind depends on the phenomena of the world. It depends on the body. It depends on the body. And so when we get reborn, when it's leaning forward, it supports itself on physical experiences, and the mind will just grab those up, and it will take up another body. If our mind is not attached to the body, which most people it is, most of us, our mind is attached to the physical realm. So we're going to get reborn where we're attached. So this is how you know. Like if you're wondering, well, where am I going to get reborn? You just look. Deep down, where is the mind supporting itself? Like what is it supporting itself on? What is it depending on? When your body is taken away, that's what's going to be left. That mind leaning, supporting, is going to grab on something else. Kind of like if we're falling, we try to grab on. So this is what the mind does. And this is something that must be observed in your meditation. If you want to understand the Four Noble Truths, you must understand how the mind is grabbing onto experiences, trying to support itself with them, acquiring them so that it will continue to exist in some way. It just needs to exist. And so we look, where is my mind supported? So if it's supported somewhere within the realm of the five senses, then you're going to be reborn either as in hell, as an animal, as a ghost, or as a human, or as one of the central heavenly planes. So as a heavenly being, you'll be reborn as something that experiences heavenly pleasant experiences. And it's really not so strange, right? When you fall asleep and you dream, why do you dream the things you do? It's because that's what your mind is thinking. That's what it's supported by. That's deep down in there. That's where the mind is at some way. And sometimes people have nightmares. Sometimes people have extremely pleasant divine dreams. So the mind, we know this, right? When we fall asleep, we can experience an entire realm of, we have a body, we experience things, we experience people. It's all there. So why would the same not be true when the body passes away? Right? So the mind, it does this. It just creates these worlds. It lives in these worlds. It supports itself with these worlds. It needs to exist because of this desire inside of it. And so it has this mind of attachment. And because we attach, we experience suffering here and now when we lose things that we love. And when we lose everything we love in this life, the mind will keep finding attachments, and it will build a new one, and it will be reborn according to that. Now, of course, we might think, oh, I'm attached to coffee, so I'm going to be reborn in a heaven with tons of coffee. No, that's not how it works, because it might be that way. I don't know why you would want that, but it also depends on our actions, right? Because if someone's very immoral, they might think, like on the surface level of the mind, they're attached to, pleasant things. But deep down, their mind is actually supporting itself with these immoral habits. That's how it supports itself. That's how it gets what it wants, through behaving immorally. That's the character it's building up. So the supports that we build, the attachments we build, that will create our suffering. Both in this life, you can observe it in this life. If you suffer in this life, just ask, am I upset because of my attachments? And the answer will invariably be yes. That's why we get upset. It's because our attachments. And then you just ask yourself, well, this mind of attachment, this mind of acquisitiveness, is it constantly trying to grab experiences? And you can know how much attachment you have when you sit down in your meditation. Because when we sit down and we close our eyes and we don't have anything else to do, why do we have thoughts coming up? Why can't we control our mind? Because it's attached. It has this behavior. It's out of our control. The mind is not self. The mind is not yours. You can't control it. It behaves according to the laws of nature. And when it has attachment, it acquires things. So when it's attached, it will acquire things, it will move. And so therefore, when we die, the mind will do the same. It'll acquire, it'll attach, it'll be reborn. And so that's the source of every suffering. In this life, it's the reason that we have past lives, it's the reason we have future lives. It's because of acquisition, it's because of attachment. So super basic, but also super profound. And so there's a sutta where the Buddha, he tells the monks, essentially he gives instructions that the monks, the practitioners, Buddhist practitioners, should be doing self-inquiry. They should be inquiring within themselves. He says, what should you inquire? He says, you should inquire the various forms, yang koidang dukkha, yang koidang aneka vidhang nana pakarakang dukkhang loke upajjati jaramaranang. So the various forms of suffering that arises in this world with all kinds of different manifestations, starting with old age and death. He says we reflect. Kisming sati jaramaranang hoti. When what is there does old age and death come to be? So what is the condition for old age and death? Like what is it that old age and death relies on? Right? So like why do we get old age? What is it that makes us get old? What makes us die? Right? So I already gave one answer. It's because we're born. So we don't die because of, say, a car accident or a heart attack. We die fundamentally because we're born. That's the fundamental reason. So we can avoid car accidents, but we can't avoid birth, assuming we're already born, right? It can't be avoided now. So now we can't avoid old age and death. So once birth is here, old age and death must be here. If birth is not here, old age and death will not be here. So in the same way, the Buddha says we need to investigate. And in one sutta, in this self-investigation sutta, he says, upadhi. So he says acquisition or attachment, when that is there, old age and death will come to be. Right? So he says this as a teaching that must be investigated. So you must see it in yourself. He says this is how a monk rightly investigates so that they can end dukkha. So what does it mean to investigate the Dhamma? It means to see how this attachment causes old age and death. See this. You need to practice for this. So this is what he's telling Mettagu. And then the Buddha continues. So we've gone on with this, but this is actually very important, so it's worth discussing, right? So this is the Buddha's answer. Upadhi nidana bhavanti. That upadhi is the source, it's the cause, it's the reason that suffering of the various forms comes to be. And then he says, Yove avidva upadhin karoti. So whoever ignorantly, whoever not knowing, creates upadhi, creates attachments, that fool will return to suffering again and again. Puna punang means again and again. So whoever with ignorance, whoever out of ignorance creates attachments, they will return again and again to suffering. They will enter suffering again and again. So why do we have constantly these mind states of I'm not happy, I'm discontent, or we get sad, we get angry, we get frustrated, we get greedy, we get again and again we enter that. Why do we enter it all the time, constantly, again and again? Because of upadhi. Why? Because we're ignorant. Avidya, so that's ignorance. This is what he says. Yo avidva. So whoever doesn't know, they create attachments. And because of that, they enter upadhi. So why is it that we're attached? We might think like, oh, so attachment is the source, so why can't I just stop? It's because we just don't understand what is going on. We don't understand life. We don't understand suffering. We think it's me. We think it's mine. So we think this body, it's difficult, but it's me. It's who I am. This mind, this awareness, these choices, these perceptions, the feelings, they're mine. I experience them. They're me. So we're confused about that. We think they're permanent. We think they're reliable. We think that we can find safety in them. We think we can find pleasure in them. So all these delusions, fundamentally, we just don't get it. And so we form attachments. And because of that, the mind keeps getting involved. And so the mind is confused. It doesn't know. It doesn't know what it's doing. And so this is also familiar, if you're familiar with Paticca dependent origination, which is what the Buddha is teaching here. Dependent origination and the Four Noble Truths, they're the exact same thing. Just one is in more detail than the other. And so ignorance is the cause, it's the root of things like our attachments, our choices, our the different things that we do, which then build up suffering. So it's because we're ignorant, and that's what the Buddha is saying. And so then he says, Tasma pajanang, so therefore, understanding. So he's saying, therefore, basically you, Mettagu, but you, right? Everyone. We should understand to not make attachments, to not attach. Tasma pajanang upadhina kaira. Dukkha sajati pabhavanopasi. Contemplating, observing closely the origin of dukkha and jati, of dukkha and rebirth. So this is the same theme I've been going into. So the Buddha is saying, because of ignorance, we form these attachments. So therefore, he says, what you need to do is we need to understand to not form attachments by contemplating the origin of suffering. The origin of suffering and rebirth. So this is the exact same theme that I've been discussing, and it's the theme in the sutta that I referenced. So we need to investigate in ourselves how attachment creates suffering and how the mind has attachment. We need to investigate what are we getting attached to so that our mind understands that it's not worth it. And that's what the Buddha's advice is to Mettugo. So he gives him a simple teaching. He basically explains the Four Noble Truths, right? He explains that there's suffering, and well, suffering is kind of assumed here, but suffering is assumed, so that's the first noble truth. He explains that suffering comes to be because of upadi, because we acquire things, because we're attached to things. Our mind depends on them. And so because of that, he says that's due to ignorance, and so we need to build wisdom. We need to contemplate suffering, and we need to contemplate the origin of suffering, and we need to understand. So it's just a very simple instruction, but extremely profound. And in other suttas, the Buddha describes it in detail. So this is the fundamental answer. This is the kind of crux of the whole question. And so from now we'll go on and we'll continue discussing, but this is actually the most important point. So this is the most, well, you could say it's kind of the summary of the entire Dhamma is right here. The summary of the Buddha's teaching. And that's why maybe the Buddha answered it in 8 whole lines, right? He just really went into the answer here because Mettugo was interested and his faculties were ripe. And so this is the Buddha's answer. And so then Mettugo responds. So the Buddha has just given him this answer, and Mettugo says, Yantang apuchhimha kitayino anyantang puchhama tadingha bruhi kadhang nudhira vitaranti yoghang jating jarang soka parindavancha tang me muni sadhuya karohi tathahite vidito esa dhammo. So Mettugo says, whatever we've asked you, he actually says we, so maybe it was a group of students, but also in Pali sometimes they use we to be polite. So maybe it was actually many people. Mettugo and his students were asking us. But anyway, he says, whatever we've asked you, you have answered us. And then he says, Anyang tang puchama, we will ask you something else. So something else, let me ask you. Tadingha bruhi, explain that too, please. Tell that too as well. Tell that matter. So he's saying, you've answered everything that I've asked you. Please, I'll ask you another thing. And he says, answer this. He says, how do the wise cross the flood of rebirth, old age, sorrow and lamentation, sorrow and paridava, so despair, lamentation, or soka paridava, so it's this sorrow and mental suffering. So he says, how do the wise cross the flood? And so this is the image we've talked about. So Mettugo asked this question, and now he's saying, okay, so that's the Buddha's answer, but how do the wise do it? Like, how do they actually cross over this flood of rebirth, this flood of sorrow, this flood of suffering? How do they go about that? And he says, explain that to me, O sage. Explain it to me clearly. Explain it to me well, O sage. He calls the Buddha a muni. Muni is like a word for kind of this wise, solitary figure, this sage. It's this archetype in India of the muni. So it's just this wise sage. So he calls the Buddha this muni. He says, please explain that to me. He says, explain that to me clearly. Sadhu yakarohi. And he says, for you are one who has realized, or you are one who understands this teaching. So he says, Tatahite vidito esa dhammo. For you are one who has realized this. You are one who understands this. So he says, explain this to me, sage, clearly. Explain it to me well, for you understand this. So he has deep faith in the Buddha. And he's asking him, please explain this. Explain this to me. How do the wise cross the flood of rebirth, old age, sorrow, and lamentation? Sorrow and despair. How do they do it? And so then the Buddha answers with another very interesting answer. The Buddha also answers him another very long, 2 stanzas. So the Buddha really is responding to Mettugo here. So the Buddha then responds. But before he does that, he says something interesting. So I'll give the Buddha's response and then Mettugo's response. So these are 2 stanzas. First the Buddha speaking, then Mettugo speaking. So the Buddha says, Kittai samite dhammang dithe dhamme anitihang yang viditva sato charang tare loke visattikang tanchahang abhinandami mahesi dhammamuttamang yang viditva sato charang tare loke visattikang. Buddha says, I will extol to you, I will expound to you a Dhamma, which is visible in this very life. It's apparent in this very life. It's not hearsay. It's not reliant on mere oral tradition. Anitihang. Itihang is like, iti is like a speaking. So it's itihang is like oral tradition. So he's saying this is a visible Dhamma. This is something you can see. I will teach you something you can see in this life, not oral tradition. And Bhavati was a master of oral tradition. So Metagu's teacher, the tradition he's been practicing in, is one of oral tradition, right? It's one of hearsay. So it's one of being told things, believing in them, essentially. So it's like, believe this, or this is how it is. So it's a kind of tradition of hearsay, of knowledge that's been accumulated and acquired and said, but it's not necessarily something that's been realized or something that you can actually see for yourself. It's something you kind of have to have faith in, or you just learn a system and you inherit that system and you continue it. But the Buddha is saying, I will extol to you a Dhamma which is apparent in this very life. He says that who has understood it. So once you've understood this Dhamma and you conduct yourself mindfully, you can cross over the flood. You can cross over actually attachment to the world, he says. Tade loke visattikang. So this stickiness, this attachment to the world. He says, so once you've understood this and you wander, you practice mindfully, you can cross over the attachment to the world. So we're stuck in the world, we're stuck here. How do we cross over it? The Buddha says you can understand this Dhamma, you can see it, and you can cross over. And then Mettago says, Tanchahang abhinandami. He says, I delight, I rejoice in that Dhamma. He says, I delight in that, O great seer, that supreme Dhamma, that supreme teaching. Dhamma muttamang. So he's saying the Buddha is the supreme seer, the Mahesi. Mahesi means Maha Isi. So Maha Rishi. Rishi is like a sage or a seer. And so he's calling the Buddha the Mahesi, the Maha Isi, the great sage, the great seer. He's saying, I delight in that. That is awesome. I delight in that supreme Dhamma. And he says the supreme Dhamma, one who, having understood it, wandering mindfully, may cross over attachment to the world. So he kind of repeats the Buddha's poem back to him, but he says he's rejoicing. And so there's this little kind of just interesting exchange here, where the Buddha says something and Mettagu repeats it. And this is, you can, maybe in the Pali, you can hear it's very poetic. So that's what goes on there. So unfortunately, my translation is both impromptu and not poetic. So it's hard to kind of convey it, but that's what he says. And then the Buddha gives the response. So remember, the question was, how do the wise cross the flood? So the Buddha responds, Yang kinchi sampajanasi yodhanga dhotiryanchapi madhye ete sonandincha nivesanancha panujja vinyanang bhavena tithe Evaṃ vihārī sato appamatto bhikkhu charang hitva mamayitani jātiṃ jarang soka parindavancha idheva vidvapajaheya dukkhang. So again, this is his double stanza response. So 4 lines. He says, Yang kinchi sampajanasi. Whatever you are aware of, whatever you become aware of, below, above, across, in between. So everything, that just means everything, right? So what is below? You could say whatever we're aware of. Below might be the bad stuff. We're aware of bad things. We're aware of sickness. We're aware of poverty. We're aware of depression, anger, anxiety. So the low stuff, but also the high stuff. When you're really blissed out, if you have a great meditation, if you're super happy, if you see loved ones, the high stuff too. Also the stuff across. So everything between there, everything around there, and madhya, in the middle, between. So everything, like the plain stuff, the good stuff, the bad stuff, the high stuff, the low stuff, the between stuff, everything you're aware of, everything you experience, yang kinchi, everything. He says, Etesu nandincha nivesanancha panujja. So having dispelled, having uprooted, having removed in regards to those things. So everything you're aware of, removing nandi and nivesana. So if you're a really good Buddhist student, you might recognize the word Nandi. Nandi is in the Second Noble Truth, right? So what is the origin of suffering in the Second Noble Truth? Yayang tanha, so it's that craving. Bono bhavika, which leads to another life. Nandi raga sahagata, bound up with Nandi, which is like delight or relishing, and raga, passion. So we crave things, but we really relish them. We delight. So like we don't just want it, but we relish it, and we delight in it, and we attach to it. And then he says, tatra tatra abhinandini. So again, abhinandini is related to Nandi. So it's like taking delight in the various realms, the various things we experience, like all the different realms, we take delight in it. So heaven realms, hell realms, we don't really take delight in hell realms, but we do if we do very bad things. We put ourselves in hell by being very guilty, right? And feeling like we deserve that punishment. So we just take delight everywhere. Bad stuff, good stuff, we just can't control ourselves. So Nandi is this relishing, this delighting. Like we really delight and rejoice in the things we experience. So Nandi is kind of a more emotional defilement. It's on the level of craving. He says, so we remove everything we're aware of. We need to remove this relishing. So stop enjoying it, basically. Doesn't mean you don't experience it. In the sense that we can't, stop experiencing things in this life, but we need to remove this relishing. So when you get something good, we don't relish it and cling and delight. We need to let go of that, no matter how good it is. Yankinchi, whatever it is, wherever it is, removing relishing. And then the other thing he says we need to remove is nivesanam. So nivesanam, it has more the sense of, it literally means something like, kind of like settling down or fixating. And this defilement is specifically in relation to opinions and views and ideas. So Nandi is more emotional, like we really like stuff and we relish it. So we need to get rid of that. But we also need to get rid of nivesanam. Nivesanam is when we settle like, yeah, this is right. This is the truth. And nivesana often comes in the specific formula that the Buddha says, idang satyang moghamanyang. Only this is true. Everything else is silly. So the Buddha says that people, they adopt this attitude. So, and we might be able to see this in ourselves or in others. So people who say, for example, this is the only truth, everyone else is wrong. So this is the idea that the Buddha is saying. So it's like, only this, nothing else. Or like, this is right. So we have an opinion. So for example, nivesana would be like a fixation on, for example, an opinion of something very mundane, like, you're rearranging your furniture. You say, no, it needs to go here. Only here. This is the best spot. Everywhere else looks ridiculous. So that's just fixating on an opinion, right? So it's not really like delighting in something. I mean, it is a form of delighting, but it's more a sense of kind of our opinions. We settle in on them. So nivesana is like a settlement. It's where you settle down and you build a colony on something. You kind of settle with your house there. So nivesana is where we fixate, we settle on an opinion. And the danger with our opinions and our views is they become part of our personality and they become incredibly difficult to relinquish. Because it's like, well, we can kind of, maybe we don't get what we want, but what we think, what we believe, that we really fixate on. That we really think is, you just can't be shaken. Because when our faith is shaken, when our beliefs are shaken, our opinions are shaken, that is a crisis, right? So also our fixations on our opinions, those need to be dispelled, the Buddha says, uprooted. So whether we experience, for example, a more refined example of this the Buddha gives, which is maybe less relevant to many people, but it existed in the time of the Buddha, it still exists today. Let's say that people experience in a state of exalted prayer and exalted consciousness or meditation, they experience bright light, and they say that it's God, they've experienced the divine. Well, according to the Buddha, that's just fixating on an opinion, on an idea, on a view about something they were aware of. So they just had a sensory experience. Doesn't matter how high or low, right? Yankinchi, whatever it is, high, low, in between, middle, whatever it is, don't form fixed opinions or fixed views about it. Just let it go. That's basically what this means. So when we experience something, we don't get kind of wrapped up in the story. We don't get wrapped up in an opinion. We just let it go. It's fine. So if we need to have we need to have opinions to function in the world, but we don't fixate on them. So maybe you think the furniture belongs over there, but your friend thinks it belongs over here. Well, whether or not it gets placed where you want it, just let go of that fixation. It doesn't need to be there. It's just an experience. It's just furniture. It'll fade. It's just a temporary experience. If you experience a deep meditation, it's just an experience. Just let it go. Nothing worth clinging onto here. You're just going to get reborn if you cling to that. So just let it go. So just whatever it is, don't form opinions about it, ideas about it that you fixate on and think must be true in that way. But we just let it go. That's what we need to do. So this is what the Buddha is saying. So both our opinions, our views, our ideas, and also our desires. So Nandi is more the desire, Nivesana is the opinion. Everything we're aware of, we need to get rid of both of these things. So fixed views and also desires, relishing. And he says, panuja, so uprooting them, removing them, dispelling them, eradicating them. Vinyanang bhavena tite. Consciousness, awareness, will not continue in existence. So you can take this in different ways because the Pali is kind of fluid, but one way of taking it is uproot our desires and our fixed opinions as well as our consciousness. So our very awareness, also that must be uprooted. It must be let go of. It must be. Because if we're attached to awareness, well, then we're going to keep getting reborn. So the awareness, vijnana, is kind of like the last barrier that our self wants to cling to. Because it's like, okay, well, maybe we're not the body, maybe we're not the feelings, but what about that which knows them? What about that which is aware? So this awareness, it's also something that needs to be let go of. It's kind of the most subtle because it doesn't have a texture, it doesn't have a color. It's that which knows those things. But that is also temporary, it's also conditioned. And so that also is the most difficult because it's, for example, observing impermanence. You can observe things changing, but what about that which is observing the change? Also that must be seen to change. Also that must pass away. Also that must be let go of. So also the awareness, also that which knows, the most subtle one. The Buddha is saying also that must be uprooted. But the word has a kind of double meaning in Pali, which I'm not sure how much the grammar is worth going into here, but it also serves as kind of the subject of the next clause the Buddha says, which is bhave natite, so will not continue in existence. Bhava is existence. So the vijnana, the consciousness, the awareness, if we uproot it, if we remove all of our attachments, all of our fixed views, all of the ways that we fixate on everything we experience, including the awareness itself, including that which experiences, if we can uproot that, then this consciousness, this flow of experience, this stream of awareness will not be able, if the causes for its continuation are removed, then that flow would not be able to continue, right? Because this is what life essentially is. The Buddha once calls it a vijnana sota, a stream of vijnana, a stream of awareness, because life is like this constant stream of being aware. And so that awareness is constantly changing and it takes on different things. And when we get reborn, that's like a radical change in our awareness. But the Buddha is saying we need to uproot the causes, uproot that so that awareness does not continue, so that the stream of awareness is able, we need to uproot the causes so that the stream of awareness is able to cease. And there's a kind of linguistic connection here. So vijnana, awareness. For example, one of the ways the Buddha talks about rebirth, he says vijnana titi. So this means like stations of awareness. You can almost think of it as like if you turn a radio station, different wavelengths, you'll hear different sounds, you'll experience different things. So it's almost like our consciousness is at a certain level. This is the human level. But if it were at a different level, we would be experiencing a different realm of existence. So these are the stations of consciousness, vijnana titi. So it's where consciousness is kind of existing at. And so when the Buddha says vijnanam, he says consciousness, assuming these conditions are in place, he's telling Mettagu to have consciousness not continue in existence. The word here is titte, which is related to titi. So it means like anywhere that consciousness can exist, anywhere it can continue flowing, that needs to be let go of, and that needs to stop, because that is fundamentally, that's how rebirth works. So that's the Buddha's answer there. So everything we're aware of, dispelling nandi and nivesana, so that consciousness is able to cease. That's the goal. And then he says, so dwelling diligently, mindfully in this way. So someone who's practicing in this way, because remember the question is about how to practice. So practicing, whenever we become aware of something, we look, am I delighting in this? Am I relishing in this? Am I fixating on this? Am I building opinions and ideas about it, including ideas about a self? He says, so someone who's practicing mindfully and diligently in this way, kind of wandering, so a mendicant, here bhikkhu, so he's referring to a monks because bhikkhu means mendicant, so someone who goes for alms round, who goes for bhiksha. So this is addressed obviously to a spiritual renunciant, Mettagu, as well as to an audience of monastics who have preserved it. But if you're really practicing, then it applies to everybody, not just bhikkhus. So he's saying that a mendicant who is wandering and practicing ardently and mindfully in this way, dispelling mamayitani. Mamayitani comes from the word mama, which actually means mine. Mamaita means like things that are mine. And so it means possessions. So it's like wandering in this way, the person having dispelled their possessions, so everything they consider theirs. Again, this kind of relates to the original question of upadi. So acquiring things, the Buddha is saying, wandering mindfully in this way, and someone who's dispelling all their possessions, dispelling their sense of me and mine, dispelling their sense of what they own. You don't own any of it. It just comes into life and it disappears. So we don't own anything. This body arose, we didn't create it, it just arose, it will pass. All the things we have, they arose, they will pass. So they're not ours, we just think they're ours. So practicing in this way, we're supposed to be dispelling our sense of possessiveness on the world, all of our possessions, which would include both physically, like not having as much stuff, and also mentally, like dispelling our possessiveness over things. That's what this practice is supposed to be. And then he says, so someone practicing in this way will, in this very life, make an end of dukkha. They will relinquish dukkha, having understood rebirth, old age, sorrow, and lamentation. So someone practicing in this way, they will, in this very life, understand these things, and they will be able to relinquish dukkha. So they'll be able to relinquish the round of existence, the round of rebirth, the mental agitation and suffering and anxiety and depression, everything. They'll be able to relinquish it if they practice in this way ardently. And so that's the Buddha's answer there. Then Mettagu says, Etabhinandami vacho mahesino sukittitam gotamanopadhikam Adhahi bhagava pahasi dukkhang tathaite vidito esa dhammo te chapino nappajaheyo dukkhang ye tvang muni attitang ovadeya tang tang namassami samicchanagang appeva mang bhagava ovadeya. So he says, I rejoice in the words Etabhinandami vacho mahesino, in the words of the great seer. Again, Mahaishi. So the Mahesi is the great seer. And this is also a word from the Vedas. So the rishis were the poets who would channel the divine spirits, the divine energy of the cosmos and the gods, and invoke them in their prayers to make sacrifices and so on. So the rishi is the seer, the divine inspired poets of the Rig Veda, and he is calling the Buddha the rishi, the Maha Rishi, the great rishi. He's saying, I rejoice, I delight in the words of the great seer. He says, well expounded by Gautama is non-attachment. Anupadi. So he says, anupadikang. So the state of anupadi, without upadi. So he's saying it's been well explained by the Buddha. So the Buddha has explained it at quite some length now, right? We've been discussing this for quite some time. So the Buddha has explained it quite well. He's saying, sukititang, well explained by Gautama. Gautama is the clan name of the Buddha. So he's referring to the Buddha when he says Gautama and Mahesi, these are words for the Buddha. So he says he's delighting. And then he says, Adhahi Bhagava Bahasi Dukkang. So certainly the Bhagava, the Buddha, again, the Blessed One, the Buddha, has abandoned dukkha. So he's saying, basically saying, it's been so explained, it's been so well explained by you, Buddha, that certainly you have given up dukkha. So certainly you're not just saying it, but certainly the Buddha has actually realized this. And because he says, for truly, tatahite vidito esa dhamma, for truly you have understood this dhamma. So the same line he said before, he's saying here. So he's saying, he's rejoicing, and he's saying, certainly the Buddha has relinquished dukkha, for he is the one who has realized the Dhamma. So he's the one who actually realized this. He's the one who actually knows it. And then he says, and also, those people who are aspiring to relinquish suffering, so also those people, so basically the Buddha's disciples, also them, he's saying, who the Muni, who the sage, frequently instructs, attitang ovadeya. So the Buddha frequently instructs his disciples in just this way, the exact same way. He's saying that he's saying that essentially they would also abandon suffering, because the Buddha, if you just imagine, if you're being instructed frequently in these teachings and you're actually practicing them, well then what's going to happen? So he's saying also, because he knows the Buddha is such a great teacher, and because the Buddha has explained these things so well, and because he has such faith that the Buddha has realized them, he's saying also the Buddha's disciples, who have been instructed by the Buddha frequently, also they will give it up. So that's the kind of rough, loose meaning of that. And then he says, I bow to you, I pay homage to you, I pay homage having met the Naga. Naga is a dragon, or also like an elephant. So it means like a great spiritual animal, like a mighty, powerful animal. And it's an epithet for the Buddha. So he's calling the Buddha the Naga. So it's like the giant, the spiritual giant. He's like a great elephant or a great dragon. So this mighty, powerful being. He's saying he rejoices having met the Naga, having met the great being. And then he says, hopefully the Buddha will also frequently teach me. Apeva mang bhagava ovadeya. So hopefully the Buddha will also instruct me. So he's saying like the Buddha, all these disciples of the Buddha, basically they're so fortunate. Hopefully he wants to become a disciple of the Buddha too. So he's very much been convinced by this. And then the Buddha responds. So the Buddha's response, this is the last line of responses here, last two stanzas. The Buddha's response is interesting because he actually answers in a very humble way. So Metegu said that surely the Buddha has given these things up and so on. And the Buddha says, Yang Brahmanang Vedagung Abhijanya Akinchanang Kama Bhaveya Satang Adhahi So Ghamimang Atari Tinno Chaparang Akhilo Akankho Vidvacha So Yo Vedago Narodha Bhava Bhave Sangamimang Visajja So Vidatanho Anigho Niraso Atari So Jati Jaranti Brumi. He says, whatever Brahman you know, who's a Vedagu, who's a master of the Veda, who's a knowledge master. So whatever Brahman you know, who's a master of the Vedas, who is akinchanam, who has nothing, they own nothing, they consider nothing their own, and who's kama bhavaya satang, not attached to sensual existence, to the existence of the sensual sphere. Another way of taking this is like they have nothing, and they're not attached either to the senses, the sensual realm, so eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, or to bhava, existence in general. So it can be taken in different ways, but I think the way that it's probably more likely is saying they have nothing, and they're not attached to sensual existence. He says, Adahi so ogami mangatari, certainly that person, so whoever is like that, so this would include the Buddha, but anyone who has these qualities, they have certainly crossed this flood. Again, the flood, the ogha of the defilements, ogha of suffering, ogha of rebirth. So anyone they have nothing, they're not attached to sensual existence, and they're a master of knowledge. Anyone that Metagu knows who is like that, certainly they have crossed the flood. And he says, Tinno chaparang, they've crossed to the far, they've crossed to the beyond, they've gone to the far shore, they've crossed over the flood. Tinno means crossed over. Parang is the far shore. Akilo akanko. So akilo means they don't have any kila. And also akanko, they don't have any kanka. So kila means something like hard-heartedness. And it's the sense of, for example, like when you're living with people and you're annoyed by them. So your heart becomes kind of closed off, right? It gets kind of tense. The mind is sort of dry. It's almost like in a state of constant dryness because it's sort of irritated by its environment. Or also it can be like if you're unethical, then your heart becomes very dry. So it's like this emotional dryness, this emotional stiffness and toughness like leather. So not like a soft heart, but just a very stiff one from things like unethical conduct and anger and so on and frustration. So when we have these qualities, our heart becomes very tough. And so he's saying that this Brahman, they don't have any of that. They don't have any of that quality in them. And also, they have no doubts. Akanko means without any doubt. So they're completely certain. Like they don't have any questioning about, they're not uncertain about things. So they completely know how things work. And they know about their freedom, so they completely know those things. So this is a quality of the Buddha, it's a quality of any arhat, is that they have complete certainty of their awakening. Like they have no doubt whatsoever. So if you have ever felt confused or doubtful or unsure, they have none of that. And so this is what the Buddha is saying. This is what you can attain, right? By following this. Any Brahmin. So any Brahmin, also by the way, in the Buddhist teachings, Brahmin doesn't mean someone of a certain caste, but the Buddha redefines Brahmin as a spiritual practitioner. So advanced spiritual practitioner. But he's also speaking to someone in a Brahminical tradition. So he's kind of using this rapport here. And then he says, essentially that person who is here a knowledge master having understood, so that person having understood who is here a knowledge master, whoever is here a knowledge master, who has untangled or pulled out the trap or the bond to various realms of existence. So we're caught in constantly wanting to be, constantly wanting to exist, right? So this is what we've talked about. So our mind is constantly wanting to be something. It wants to exist. It wants to continue. And so this person, they've seen the trap in that, and they've kind of gotten free of it. They've rid themselves of that trap. So he's saying that that person, they've rid themselves of the trap, of the bond, of the snare to various realms of existence. He says, they are vita tanho, rid of craving. Anigho, this means like essentially rid of trouble, rid of problem, rid of worry, rid of all that. So they're rid of this kind of mental worry and trouble. So their mind is very pure. Vita tanho, without any craving, without any trouble, without any worry. And niraso. Niraso means without any hope. They have no hope. They're hopeless because they don't expect anything. They don't hope for anything. How could it get any better? They've already crossed over the flood. So it's like, why would you hope for safety if you've already found it? So they don't have any hopes. They don't have any expectations because they know that within the realm of samsara, nothing is worth hoping for. And there's no safety. There's no further anything that they hope to attain because they've already attained it. So they have no aspiration, no expectation, no hope because they don't need it. They've gone beyond it. And he says, that person has crossed beyond atari so jati jiranti brumi. He says, I declare, I say that that person has gone beyond, has crossed over rebirth and old age. So that's how the Buddha ends Metagu's answer. And at this time we can close and pay respects to the poem with 3 sadhus, and then we will see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, sadhu. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask at this time. And it looks like we have some people listening in, but no question except for one person saying the roots of impurities, question mark. Not sure exactly what you're referring to, but yes, briefly, the roots of impurities would count because we've basically gone over, the roots of impurities would be several different things we've listed here. And so those would all be, in an arahant, they would uproot those things. And Anochita says, they ask if they have the link of the text. Well, yes, so I would recommend, I'll type in a link here. So one way you can get this text free of charge and copyright and so on is at Sutta Central. So Bhante Sujato has translated most of the, or all of the early suttas into English, understandable English. And so I will put here the website there, suttacentral.net. I believe that this is the link. So I just sent a link that I think should bring you to where I've been reading from. But if it doesn't, then if you just go to Sutta Central and you go to the suttas and then the minor collection, the Sutta Nipata, Pārāyanavagga, Metagu with questions. So there's a lot of different steps. But also if you look up the title of the talk, Pārāyanavagga, Metagu, so I'll type his name in here in case anyone needs that. Metagu. If you just look that up, then you can find it. And I would recommend Bhante Sujato's translation because it has the Pali and it also is more recent and more pretty good. So I'd recommend that one. Yep. Okay, if there's nothing else, then we can close. Is there anything here? No? Okay. So it looks like there's nothing else here. So we will close for the night with just 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right, so have a good night, and I hope that this is inspiring and fruitful for your practice.